Started. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our session today. I'm Colleen Malone. I'm going to be your room monitor and presenter. I'll turn it over to Dr. Foster.
I am Dr. Foster. I am a faculty member and a department chair here at the Chicago School, and I'm one of our presenters today. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Brown.
I'm Dr. Andy Brown. It's so nice to be here with you today. We were just talking about how excited we are about this presentation because it has a high education and entertainment value. I work as a full-time professor here at the Chicago School with these two wonderful people.
And this presentation has literally been years in the making. We just happened to have this really interesting point of intersection a couple of years ago with where we currently were in our lives, what we were watching on television, Netflix, in the theater, whatever the case may be. And that's how this presentation came to be. So thank you for joining us today. Today we're here to talk about Can't You See the Humans, a multidisciplinary view on vilifying people through the eyes of Hollywood. Let me see if I can get this to move. Let me move all that stuff. All right, so our objectives today. We're going to explore personal narratives around vilification, explore and challenge perspectives on profiling, and engage in activities and discussions that lead to self-discovery and insight. So there are some challenges related to profiling. And I'm going to just touch briefly on the first two, and Colleen will touch on the second two, and then we'll engage in a little activity. So the challenges to profiling is when there's a flood of too much information, when there's not enough meaning that's present in a given situation. Colleen?
Sorry about that. I had to come off mute. Yes, so not enough meaning. So sometimes there are just situations that arise and the person is placed into it, and the people interpreting that situation don't have the correct context.
And then we don't always have accurate recall of memory. And so what we don't remember becomes a problem. Colleen?
All right. And then also, especially in client situations, sometimes you just need to act fast. You need to either decide what you're going to do, and even a fight or flight reaction. Sometimes you just have to act quickly. And with that being said, we're going to do a 1-minute exercise. Speaking of quickly, Dr. Foster, you want to introduce us to that?
Yes, so we are going to flip the slide, and what we would like for all of you to do is in the chat, just begin to post what you see. Look at the surroundings, look at the context, and really quickly, without a lot of thought, just post what you see. So if you could just start popping that in the chat, that would be great.
And I'm watching the clock.
So now tell us who you think the man is. Focus in on the man and put that in the chat.
All right, 10 more seconds. Okay. Great. Good comments, good chats. Thanks, everybody. We will definitely circle back to this at the end of our presentation, and we'll talk about who we saw and what our perception was.
All right, how narratives develop. Actually, for me and so many, narratives develop very early on. We're taking in information even when we're nonverbal. As a matter of fact, so much of our relational narratives happen in the first 2 years of life when neurocognitively we're developing the relational part of our brains. When I was younger, I watched a very campy, somewhat cheesy version of Batman on television. It was the late 1960s. I was not alive then. These were reruns well after I was born. But the TV graphics, even as a child, I could kind of pick out were just a little bit behind the times. And so was some of the dialogue. It was almost like someone had brought, a graphic portrayal of a comic book to life with the pals and the baps and the different things. Every time somebody would take a swing, it would be spelled out on the screen. But as part of that, the Batman series introduced me to the Joker. And the Joker was portrayed as the quintessential evil madman. He would laugh every time that he did something diabolical. It was like he had a sadistic joy in doing harm to other people. And so it was really easy to really dislike the Joker. They made it incredibly easy. And part of that gap was I didn't really understand the Joker. I only understood one dimension, and that was the evil, the negative, the things that I kind of picked up even from a child. As that progressed through, there's been so many different iterations of the Joker, so many different iterations of Batman. And through that all, he's been portrayed as this same character. It's not only until as of late, until the 2019 version with Joaquin Phoenix as the Joker, where we begin to see a backdrop and an etiology that's never been really talked about before to any great effect to the earlier iterations. One thing that we find out is that he has this laugh that he has is not because of a sadistic joy, but because he has a pseudo bipolar effect, which basically encourages this kind of laughter and involuntary bouts of crying and laughter and these emotional responses that are not congruent to what he's going on. Can you imagine having him as a client and trying to be congruent with this individual in session? A lot of struggles with PBA with that. We were also told that he killed Bruce Wayne's parents, Batman's parents, which set up a really wonderful retaliatory relationship between them throughout the program. But we learned in the movie that it was another person dressed as the Joker that actually killed Bruce Wayne's parents. And spoiler alert, if you haven't seen the movie, it was another Joker. Joaquin Phoenix's character was actually in a car accident during the time where Batman's parents were being killed. We also, in a very profound way, see that the Joker was being raised by a mother that had significant mental illness concerns that were untreated, seemingly untreated, and this had a huge impact on his life and the development of his sociopathy. And one of the things that I'll say is I'm really careful with the fact that I think using psychology to excuse harming others is a poor use of psychology. I think really kind of digging this out from a psychological stance, helping us to understand so that we can have some sort of bond with this client is incredibly important in these narratives. But the narratives develop so early on, and it was really such a contrast when I saw the latest version to see what went on behind the scenes, the etiology of the development of this character, and it allowed me to connect with him in a different way. Colleen, if you will move forward. Thank you very much. Neurobiology. So how does this all happen? Just a little bit of background. I want to talk a minute about the amygdala, and if anybody's been in any of my presentations, they knew the amygdala would probably come up at some point because it's the epicenter for trauma, anxiety, but it also is available for attachment. It's available for sexuality, these different kinds of things. Its primary purpose is protection. And so on the side of the amygdala, there's a little pocket, like a holster, in the lateral nucleus of the amygdala. It holds sense-based memories. Why does it have sense-based memories? We've got all the rest of the brain to hold memories. The reason why is because it fires at 1/20th of a second to protect us. If Colleen is driving down the road and someone changes lanes, she doesn't have time to think through that cognitively. Well, maybe they'll see me and maybe this isn't, blah, 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 blah. She has to have like a knee-jerk response in order to avoid that car that's coming into her lane. It's incredibly important that we have that from a survival standpoint. And so the thing about that, those sense-based memories, they're not all based on any kind of reality. So one of the examples that I give is that when I first moved into my house, I laid cement pavers around the side of my yard. And because my friends wanted to come over and they wanted to see my new place, but I didn't want them tracking in and out of my new house. You know, it still had the newness. I wanted to keep the newness about it. And so I was laying down these pavers. I was on my hands and knees laying down these pavers. I got near this large pampas grass and I saw a snake. And so I jumped about 5 foot up and 10 foot over. And then I looked over and I noticed it was a piece of hose pipe. So the first thing I do is I look around to see who saw me, because who wants to be that person in your neighborhood? What's up with Jumpy Jumperton that just moved in? You know, that's the kind of thing that I was combating. So then I had a different set of fears around the social anxieties. But going back to the hose pipe, my sense-based memories detected something that looked like a snake. If I had to rely on my cognitive abilities in my cortex, it would take half a second to a second. I would already be bit if I didn't have that reaction. That's why we have those in the lateral nucleus. Now, the thing about it, those are based on senses and they're based on experiences. It's experiential. The amygdala is experiential. And so when I look back at a narrative that I established with the Joker, it was all visual and auditory, all sense-based things that I picked up and I put into that amygdala growing up that allowed me to make those assessments and judgments. That's where those knee-jerk assessments and judgments come from that kind of keep us safe. Unfortunately, they're not always based on reality. And so we have to actually challenge those things as we're moving through. So that's like a high-end overview of how we make those knee-jerk assessments. Again, the important piece here is that they are initially in there to protect us. So we don't want to kind of take those out, remove them even if we could. But we also want to realize that sometimes we have to think around those things in order to get to the truth, because the information that's in the amygdala is not always based on reality. Okay, Colleen.
Whoops. Colleen.
Thanks. So I'm going to talk about the reinforcement of vilification. If you're not familiar with the movie Frozen, it's based on the Brothers Grimm's story about the Ice Queen. And it's very Disney modified, I'll say. So you have your classic villain who comes in and does bad things and hurts people. And then you have someone who comes in at the end and says, no, they're not the villain. It's okay. Everyone's okay. And everyone loves each other, in a nutshell. So Elsa, from a very young age, is put into that situation where she follows the villain narrative. So when she's young, she's born with powers, magic, to turn things into ice and snow. The cold never bothered her anyway, right? And so she's in this situation where she's playing with her sister and inadvertently she hurts her, and the parents have to whisk the kids away to make sure that her sister doesn't die from the ice and the snow and the magic that Elsa put upon her on accident. And we'll watch a little clip of that experience in a minute. But the situation really turned traumatic because of the reaction of the parents and family. You know, the action was not intended, but how the action was reinforced was the beginning of her path in this narrative of being the villain. So her childhood experiences, you know, after this happened, all of the joy, all of the freedom, all of the things that kids should be able to explore, those are all removed from her. The parents decide to physically take her away from her sister and have her locked in a room so she can learn and determine how to best use her power, even though she's never given any tools or any coping mechanism or anything like that. They just, you know, they continually say, just pack it, you know, damp it down and don't have any emotion and lock it away. And you know, I can't speak to magical powers, but just from emotional capability, you know, that's the opposite of anything you want to do with a counselor or client, right? You want to explore your emotions, explore your paths and how you're going to face things and cope with things and, you know, move forward. And so really these childhood experiences, again, reinforced early, often as she grows into adulthood. And she doesn't emerge until she's of age to become the queen after her parents have passed away. So kind of circling back to that opening slide, not only is the narrative set from her perspective, where she doesn't have enough information, but also from people who live in the village where she becomes queen. They don't have any information. She's been locked away. They haven't seen her. They're setting their own narrative of this villain who can't be let out in public. And so she really is experiencing these emotional traumas over and over again. And as the slide says, you know, these traumas, relating back to what Dr. Brown said, working with the amygdala makes these emotional memories, and it ultimately leads to phobias. The reinforcement is the establishment of phobias. So, you know, this goes from just a narrative now to an actual physical experience that Elsa has gone through and will continue to go through. And interestingly enough, with reinforcement, so again, at the bottom of the slide, it says, remember, positive and negative reinforcement don't mean good and bad. So that dichotomy, right? Negative reinforcement simply means the decreasing or removal of that exposure, as positive reinforcement increases or makes more of the exposure happen to the individual. And so I'll say this slowly so the importance of it sinks in, because the positive reinforcement that Elsa experienced of negative circumstances led to this situation. So again, looking at that dichotomy of what is positive, what is negative, how that impacts someone, that significance was not lost on this presentation, and just kind of looking at the big picture and really seeking to understand what the individual is experiencing. So I'm going to play a clip. It's about a minute of when Elsa and her sister go to these magical trolls so they can help her sister Anna feel better. But it just shows how traumatic Elsa's first experience was into this realm of magic and having to deal with what she was born with.
I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Colleen, so you can share.
Thanks. Okay, let me know if you can hear this.
She will be okay.
But she won't remember I have powers?
It's for the best. Listen to me, Elsa. Your power will only grow. There is beauty in it, but also great danger. You must learn to control it. Fear will be your enemy. No, we'll protect her. She can learn to control it, I'm sure. Until then, lock the gates. We'll reduce the staff. We will limit her contact with people. Keep her powers hidden from everyone, including Anna.
Okay, so circling back, pretty traumatic from a childhood perspective. And that was really the beginning of the end of her experience with magic and any sort of coaching or treatment planning, you know, from a counselor perspective. And just, you know, personally watching this with my nieces and my daughter, explaining to little kids that Elsa isn't bad. It was her situation. No one taught her how to do these things. No one taught her how to be able to control her magic or to experience things in a kind way. And really just making sure that, again, even in kids and individual situations, she's not bad. It's the situation. So it's the narrative and the reinforcement of vilification.
So again, the social construction of narratives is important to consider. And I'm going to take a look at Elphaba. And so this was in the genesis of us beginning to have this conversation about 2 years ago. I went to a theater production of Wicked. I did no homework before I went. I went based off of what I thought I knew. Again, that social construction of the narrative, based on my understanding of the Wizard of Oz and just the title, Wicked, right? Wicked implies some sort of vilification. And so I went in cold on purpose. And I too had the idea that Elphaba's character, the Wicked Witch, was just a villain, because that's the narrative that's been passed down. That's the culture of the Wizard of Oz. And so no one really recalls the good with her until much later on in the production. And this really, for me, brought up Kitchener's moral principles, which warrant some exploration. And so just from the place of autonomy, if we even look at our counseling code of ethics and ethical decision-making models, when we think about autonomy, straight from the model, it says may or may not be perceived within the context of the society in which they live, and how this may impinge the right of others. And so there's a play on that in this social construction of vilification. There's a play on it in the construction of the movie or the production of Wicked and Wizard of Oz. When we go to Kitchener's second moral principle of doing no harm, when we think about the Joker, when we think about Elsa, when we think about Elphaba, that moral principle is at play. When we think about doing good, whether it be individual good, societal good, the idea of doing good is one that is embedded into our code of ethics. It's embedded into the society in which we find ourselves when we live. Justice. How did we determine that she was bad, evil, or a villain? We use the social construction of what we thought her narrative was to determine that. And then there's the idea of fidelity, where there's this loyalty, faithfulness, and the honoring of commitments. And so it calls into question, was the commitment to be bad or good? So Elphaba really does, in Wicked, represent this dichotomy that is woven throughout the idea of vilification, where it's this idea, this moral judgment of, is it one thing or isn't it one thing? Is it right or is it wrong? Is it correct? Is it incorrect? Is it good? Is it evil? Is it bad? Is it good? And so when we look at just the ethical underpinnings of how we construct narratives, we have to take into account how we've arrived there. We have to take into account Kitchener's moral principles and whether or not we're acting on a dichotomy. Dr. Brown.
Absolutely. So thank you very much, Dr. Foster, and really wonderful conversations around Elphaba. And one of the things that she said, I think was important, and to echo what Colleen had mentioned earlier, the need to act fast. When you're in session and you have knee-jerk reactions, that can be, of course, your amygdala firing to protect you. However, it may not be based on the reality of an honest or open threat. So when we make these knee-jerk reactions and whatnot, it's up to us to challenge them. One of the things that Dr. Foster said is she went in to see Wicked open. She didn't do any research ahead of time. She went in to experience this. And that's something that I encourage when you're moving through and with clients and meeting people in any shape, form, or fashion, to go in open to the possibilities of a different thought than what you're having, a different action and reaction than what you're having. And we do that by relaxing the body and breathing. This helps to take the amygdala offline so we can access more of our cortex. Because once the amygdala is activated, the rest of the brain is just along for the ride. So we actually have to activate the rest of the cortex by relaxing the amygdala. We do that by deep breathing, by relaxing our bodies, and being open cognitively to what's going on in front of us.
Colleen, Elsa?
Yep, great. So to echo what I had said a little while ago, there was just not enough meaning to their story, both from Elsa's own personal journey and then those around her. Elsa didn't know. She didn't know how to embrace her gift. She didn't know how to control it. And then again, the townspeople and her sister, they didn't know why she was locked away. No one, they could conjecture that she was magical, even, probably in a negative way, in a villain way. But there was never any story. So people were able to make their own.
And with Elphaba, the Wizard of Oz is not wicked. And so there's this plethora of information that exists for us to draw on. And as Dr. Brown mentioned in his slide, not everything we draw on is reality. The hose isn't a snake sort of situation. And so sometimes there's this flooding effect where we're given too much information and it leads to us making a very dichotomous decision: good, bad, evil, good, isn't, right, wrong, correct, incorrect. And so what should we remember? That these ideas of too fast, not enough, too much leads to presets about who our clients are going to be. And we've offered up some of our own experiences here in terms of what it means to be a court-ordered client or someone who's referred for counseling. I'm wondering if you all have any other examples of when these presets of vilification might come into play. Is there something in your own worlds, and you can pop them into the chat, that you see as, yes, this might come up for me, this dichotomous, triggered idea of who the client sitting before me is?
You can type them in or feel free to come off mute too.
I think one of the things that came to mind for me, Dr. Foster, as you were sharing that, is that somebody can walk in 2020, there were plenty of reasons to be triggered, and there was plenty of vilification to go around. And it even pours over now. You have individuals who, some people are pro-vaccine, some people are con-vaccine, some people are pro-mask, some people are con-mask, these different kinds of things. And people can just walk into a room and display, their beliefs, their thoughts by what they're wearing or not wearing, or how they feel about certain things. And it's very easy to get into vilification in those situations.
Absolutely. One of the stems that I use with my students when I'm teaching, Dr. Brown, where this is concerned, is the stem of, I would never see a client who, and then fill in the blank. Well, how did you arrive at that, right? It's that dichotomous thought, never, ever will I ever. And so how did we arrive there?
Okay, I don't see any comments coming in, so I hope everyone's still awake.
Well, we have a lovely graphic, so this will wake them up. So we have been referring to the ideas of what you should remember, too much information, not enough meaning, need to act fast. This is one of my favorite tools to share with students and clients. It's a cognitive bias wheel. And if you look around, I guess that's the diameter of the circle, there are all of these presets that kind of happen that get us into the position of how we make decisions. And if you look, there's kind of this zoom out, zoom in kind of idea. We'll make sure that you guys get a copy of the, well, Colleen's put the link in the box. But if you zoom in really, really close, here are the things that we kind of do that kind of set it off.
Mm-hmm.
And then
I have it up on my screen if you want me to share it. I wasn't
sure.
It was too small on that one.
Let me stop sharing. Go ahead, Colleen. Feel free.
There we go. And I did put the link in the chat as well. But this is really interactive because you can click through all of these things and it will bring you to the summary, ratio rules, related effects.
The theory that underlies each piece of it. You know, if we think about my example of too much, you know, this is all too much, but I noticed that something has changed. Is she really a villain? That was my experience. Going off of the social constructs of who Elphaba should have been to me when I walked into the theater, right? So yes, it's a super interactive tool. We really love this, and we, Felice, it's in the. We shared the link in the chat. Mm-hmm. So for anybody who wants it, the link is there. We'll refer back to this in just a few minutes. So Colleen, if you want to stop sharing, I'll start sharing again. Maybe. Let's see. There we go. Play around with it. It's a great tool. And if you work with students or supervisees, fantastic tool to bring into the classroom or the supervision room. So now we want to talk about some strategies. Now that we've kind of primed the pump to understand that we all go there. We may not go there in terms of this person's a villain and this is all they're ever going to be and I can't see them as anything else, but we all go there, and Hollywood kind of helps give us a push in that direction to go there, right? To have this idea of persistent vilification. And so we really wanted to spend some time in our presentation talking about strategies that are very useful, again, whether you find yourself as a student, whether you find yourself as an instructor, whether you find yourself as a counselor, whether you find yourself as a supervisor. We chose some strategies that would be helpful regardless of the position you find yourself in. So as an existentialist, I love being in the existential gray with my clients, my supervisees, my students. It's really a life philosophy because it requires and tasks me to look at something other than the bookends. It requires me to look at what happens in the middle. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Brown to talk some about existential exposure. Dr.
Absolutely.
Brown?
Thank you very much, Dr. Foster. Existential exposure is the idea of you're exposing yourself to something that's sense-based. And let's say you're struggling with a specific individual or population. Sometimes the best way to change those knee-jerk reactions is to actually spend more time with that population in a non-threatening manner. The reason why is because the amygdala is only rewired when it gets warm. As I've been around, I've been fortunate to go around the country and different places around the world to present. And from where I currently live, we have this phenomenon called sweet tea. Actually, most of my conversations with Dr. Foster are surrounded around sweet tea. She's normally driving through some drive-through to get herself a large sweet tea when we're talking. But when I go to other places, you know, it's not a norm. If you ask for sweet tea, they give you a funny look, and they bring out some unsweet tea and a little packet of sugar, and you pour it in, and it's this really depressing thing where it falls to the bottom, and you stir it, and it falls to the bottom. It doesn't sweeten. The reason why is because in order for tea to be really sweet, you have to heat it up and then pour the sugar in so it melts together. The amygdala is the same way. What fires together wires together. So you actually have to warm the amygdala through exposing it to something that causes it to actually be on, something that exposes it to what it's anxious about or threatened by in a relaxed state in order to rewire it in a positive way. So this existential exposure is the idea of if there is a population, a situation, diagnoses that you might struggle with, immersing yourself in a safe way with those individuals of that population is sometimes the best way to actually confront that cognitive or subcognitive bias.
One of the things that I challenge is focusing on the what is versus the what ifs. And so again, going back to the idea of going in cold, not in reference to the sweet tea, but going in cold and not making the assumption that you know someone's story. I can remember that this happened really early on with me in my career. I had my I will never work with this specific population sort of taglines and disclaimers. And one of my first clients taught me more about who I was going to be as a therapist than my master's program ever did. Because he fell into the category of I will never. And in my internship, they said, oh, yes, you will. And so I had to position myself in such a way to confront the things I didn't know and to confront the things I thought I knew. Which, again, coupled with the next strategy, which is externalizing of behaviors to really encourage this reauthoring, when I was able to separate the behaviors, because it wasn't, I didn't want to see this person. I didn't want to see someone who exhibited XYZ behavior. And through being able to externalize the behaviors and really reauthor who this person was, I was able to see them as a person, their behaviors as behaviors, and really separate the two in order to humanize the person sitting before me. Because I had not done that up until that point. It took a lot of supervision to get me to the place where I could. Which again leads to this place of really understanding differences and building safety. If it's not safe, it can't work. And so really understanding when someone comes in the room and they trigger, challenge, or present some sort of response in you, or reaction, I would say, not even response. It's really important to understand where's the safety in the situation. Because if you're feeling unsafe in the situation, they're probably equally as unsafe. And so it's around doing some of this work before you ever get in the room. Your first experience with sweet tea should never be in the counseling room. You should have an understanding of firing and wiring before that happens. Which brings us back to that idea of using the cognitive bias wheel. I challenge you to think about the stem that maybe came up for you in this presentation, or when you watch a movie and you're like, yes, if this person, Dr. Brown and Colleen and I can't watch movies the same way really anymore when we're doing this kind of work, because it always comes back to this. Hey, did you see this thing? And what did you think about this? And how does it align with, what we're presenting on and whatever else the case may be? And so if you find yourself having a reaction to something that's Hollywood, even though it's probably grossly exaggerated, I think we can all agree on that, or even in the counseling room, if you find yourself having a reaction, or if you find yourself saying, I would never work with this client, go back to the wheel. Do some preemptive work to say, what's really going on with me that's creating this? I was waiting for you to change the slide, Colleen. It's me. Okay, so approaches. Dr. Brown, recap.
Absolutely. So one thing to keep in mind, and this is important, I mentioned earlier that basically immersing yourself or exposing yourself to a population, whether it be a population of individuals or diagnoses or things like that you avoid, that you would typically avoid. It's really important for you to make sure that it's safe. So by no means am I saying, well, you know, if going to dimly lit places in large cities at night where crimes normally take place is something that causes you angst, you have to make some judgments there about what's really safe. However, when you're talking about clients and you're talking about different populations and you're talking about different subsets of diagnoses and whatnot, finding perhaps groups that you can involve yourself in or co-lead, or being open to take different clients that you feel competent to take may help you to rewire that part of the amygdala that fires when it normally shouldn't because of biases that you have in there. So just some things to kind of keep in mind as you're moving forward and working towards this goal.
And so my recap from this idea of a social constructivist theory is actually twofold. One is remember the reauthor, that it's a really comforting thought for me as an existentialist to recognize that I'm not the expert in the room, that it's really my client who's the expert. And so for me to walk in and assume villain status is really taking away my client's autonomy to be the expert on their own condition. And so one is remember the reauthor, and also go back to those moral principles and look at them on a continuum as opposed to a dichotomy. Is it good or bad? Is it justice or not? Because, you know, that's the essence of every ethical dilemma, is that it is the gray. And so really thinking about how do those moral principles apply when we're not viewing them in a dichotomous fashion. Colleen?
Thanks, Dr. Foster. I'm picking up on that dichotomy. Remember that positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement don't mean good and bad. It just means the quantity of the exposure. And so when you're working with a client, or you know, even from an admin perspective, I'm not a counselor by trade, but I feel like I speak counselor sometimes because I'm surrounded by such strong ones. But you know, just even in everyday life and working with friends and family, especially over this last year, just remember that everyone has had their own reinforcements, good, bad, in between, as to what they're coming into the situation with. So they've had a narrative, they're currently in the moment with you, and then as a client, you'll be working forward to set that the future narrative and to set those reinforcements, again, positive, negative, meaning quantity, not quality. So just take that into consideration as you're looking at the cognitive bias wheel and, you know, living in the moment, living in the gray, and even working with, you know, friends and family. Everyone can be a villain one day. Everyone can be a hero the next. So that was my approach.
And you'll notice the pictures that we selected for this presentation are all relevant. Every other, when we were talking about every other approach, you would have seen pictures of people with the focus being on the eyes. We'll get back to the who do you see thing in just a second. With this one, it's this intersectionality. You see all of the points on the thought collective kind of coming together. That wasn't an accident either. Dr. Brown, Colleen, and I all come from very different approaches when we looked at this, and yet we all landed in the same location at the end of the day around not the how vilification shows up, but just that it does. And so hopefully you were able to find yourself in one of these approaches and something spoke to you in terms of, yes, that's the way I see the world, and I can absolutely see myself using some of these strategies and approaches in terms of recognizing how I view vilification. So we want to get back to our beginning activity. So Colleen, I'm going to let you say more about who was in our picture at the beginning.
Sure. So circling back, and if anyone wants to see the picture, I can
go backwards.
Okay. Just to circle back and refresh. But again, we really wanted to take a look at a person who we think they are. So we talked about someone who's running, maybe running away from someone or something, running with gloves on, maybe ready to fight, maybe not. Just all their impressions. It looks like they're out of prison, maybe scrubs. Let's see. I don't think I missed any comments. If so, again, come off mute and let me know. He's smiling. Maybe at a train station, maybe at a prison. But anyway, that was, we put you in a situation where you had to respond quickly, right? You didn't have a story and you had to respond quickly. And so we wanted to let you know that whatever your perception was, this man, his name is Rasan New York Thomas, and he is actually part of the podcast, now Pulitzer Prize nominated podcast, Ear Hustle. And if you're not familiar with Ear Hustle, it's a podcast started by inmates to share their experiences leading to their incarceration, and then within incarceration, and then being released as well. So again, it takes that bad guy persona, the vilification, and it breaks it down and it makes them all human, right? It tells their story, it tells their narrative. And so I wanted to not only bring this to your attention, if you hadn't heard of it before, they're amazing to listen to, but also just to reinforce that, you can be a prisoner, you can be the bad guy one day, and then if you're acquitted or released into the next day, then you become the good guy and you can give back to your community and you can inspire others and become a Pulitzer Prize nominated individual. And so just to kind of re-examine your initial perspectives, go back to that cognitive bias wheel, look at our strategies and things like that, a way to begin and end the presentation. I can put these links in the chat as well so you have them.
And this is an excellent immersion activity to go in and listen. I've been doing it for a couple of days because I chose to use a different person for the Who Do You See? And when Colleen told me about him, I went in and started to listen right away. And so it's a great immersion activity in terms of priming the pump to really kind of get into this dichotomous idea of villain versus hero in terms of how do you view the world. And it's really interesting to view it in a different way, in different space. Now we left some time for questions. Does anybody have questions for us or comments? Please come off of mute or put it in the chat and tell us what you think, or if you have questions.
Come on camera, we'd like to see everybody.
I have a question. So I'm actually a second-year student at the Chicago School, and I'm currently in my first practicum, and we're learning kind of these like biases and the diversity aspect of with our patients and the micro and macro levels. But I guess personally, what I would like to know is like when we think about like separating the behaviors and the person, what about like our personal biases that could be triggering? Like how could we go about that, like moving forward with a patient that might come into like a community setting at practicum sites? We can't pick and choose our patients. So what if there is someone that comes in and we obviously have a bias towards them because of like our past experiences? How would you advise on moving forward with that and using these like keeping these techniques and things in mind?
Dr. Brown, you want to take that first?
Sure. Thank you. That's a wonderful question, and it's something that I think a lot of students, neophyte students, when they first start out, struggle with. Dr. Foster actually said earlier when she began, she was like, there's some clients that she was not going to sit with, and now she'll pretty much sit with anybody on Earth or from other planets. So how does one get there? Through exposure. And so if there is something, now this is a critical point, I want to make sure that I just like laser focus in on what I believe that you're asking here. What if you're genuinely triggered by someone when they come in? You certainly don't want to do any harm to an individual. What we would say typically is that we might recommend it may be advantageous to get your own personal work done around that. There could be a trigger there for a reason. There could be a past incident or something that you have experienced or another person's experienced that causes that trigger, you know, a bad alignment, a former abuse, these kinds of things. So making sure that the very first part of that is awareness. And it's great. What I am hearing from you is you have an awareness. And when you have an awareness, you can do something with that, but don't let it rest at awareness. The next step is getting some self-work done around that. And you want to be able to ease into the fact that maybe I can sit with these individuals as a point of exposure when I feel safe. But at first, you have to make sure that you're working on anything that keeps you from feeling safe and sitting with these individuals. Dr. Foster, would you like to add anything, or Colleen?
Yes, I would agree that safety piece is paramount for both you and your client. You know, in counseling, it's in our code of ethics that we do not refer out based on deeply held value. And so I think that even that recognition that ethical standard is there, it tasks us with really doing some pre-work. And as much pre-work as we can do, that doesn't mean we're not going to be triggered in the moment if something comes up. You know, no matter where you are in your career, you know, in the beginning we call it supervision. We just change the name and call it consultation. Yeah. After you're no longer required to get supervision. I cannot underscore the importance of having quality supervision around this as well, because there's a professional and a personal piece you have to attend to. And so, you know, for the students on the call, remember that you're interviewing your supervisors just like they're interviewing you to see if it's a good fit. And so making sure that you have on-site support. So when those kinds of things happen, I didn't say if, I said when those kinds of things happen, you have built-in support to go and say, you know, Dr. Brown, you're never going to believe what came up for me today. You know, the idea that countertransference will never happen to us, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. I say that to say we have to normalize that experience, we're going to have these situations where we butt up against our deeply held values or our traumatic experiences or whatever else the case may be. And so making sure you have the support would be the only other thing I would add, the professional support.
Thank you so much. That was excellent advice. I appreciate it.
Welcome. Other thoughts or comments? Just so you all know, I have a sweet tea out of camera focus, in case you were wondering. Thank you for that, Dr. Brown.
You get a round of applause for the analogy. That was well done.
Very well. So, Colleen, you put ear hustle in the chat, right?
I did.
The cognitive bias wheel, ear hustle, all in the chat. Of course, we're always here to support, and you know how to find us if you're a Chicago school individual. If you're not, we're on the Chicago school website. Colleen, you can even pop our emails into the chat. We love talking about this, so feel free to reach out if you have more questions or comments that happen beyond the scope of the presentation.